care for a tea? That's a greeting you would have probably heard frequently in colonial times. Their beverages were very important to them. And their beverages are part of American history. And we can tell some of the story of the American history through their beverages. Now take tea. Tea was one of the most incendiary of the beverages because of the tea tax, even to the point where they put political messages on their teapots. Tea was the society beverage. If you had money, that was one of your ways to flaunt it. You had fancy tea sets. You had a tea chest. Your tea chest had compartments to store your tea. It had a place for the sugar, because sugar was very expensive in colonial times. And you had a means to lock it. Now, a tea chest this size would have been for a merchant or someone doing well. But if you were a plantation owner, your tea chest would be very large, and you'd be able to lock it and transport it. And it would be displayed in a prominent area of your home, because they didn't have Rolexes, they didn't have Porsches, they had their tea in their tea set. Tea came from China, and if you had the money, your porcelain tea set came from China also. Tea was rather different from ours. If you open up a tea bag today and look at a tea bag, it's almost like dust. But their tea was much coarser, and you can almost see the leaves that are there. This is what they call a gunpowder tea, and it refers to the way that the tea was processed. If you went to the merchant, your tea would be packaged in paper and maybe the name written on. Now, one little thing, Martha Washington drank tea every morning. But unlike our tea today, she drank chocolate tea, and it was made with the husks from cacao beans. So it came out a little differently. And that's what Martha had every morning for breakfast. Tea was their society drink, and if you had a party, your party could be judged by the amount, the quantity, and the quality of the tea that you had. Tea. Now, the next beverage was coffee. Coffee hasn't changed very much from colonial times. The beans would come in, they'd be roasted, they'd come in green, and then they'd be ground and boiled and made coffee. Coffee came from the Middle East originally, and later it came from the West Indies and places in Africa. It came from various places. Now, to go with their coffee and their tea, sugar came from the West Indies, and that was one of the big things that Christopher Columbus brought back. He didn't bring the spices in the tea that they were hoping he'd bring from the West Indies. Instead, he brought sugar, and with sugar came rum. Now, sugar in colonial times came in a formed cone. It would be wrapped in paper. The paper would be sealed, and it's kind of like a label that we have today. It would be marked with wax, and that way you knew where your sugar was coming from. Now, they also had a very special tool called a sugar nipper. The sugar nipper, they would nip off pieces of sugar to use for serving. And ladies, if you were having a tea party, you wanted to make sure that the sugar was nipped before your friends came. It was considered very, very bad form to nip in front of company. And like I showed you in the tea chest, the sugar was a little different from ours. It wasn't quite as refined, so it was more of a brown color with a little more molasses left in it. Chocolate was one of the other favorite drinks of the colonists. Chocolate came from Central and Central America and South America came from the jungles. If you were out in the jungle and you saw something like this in a tree, that's what a cacao pod looks like. When it ripens, it turns an orange. And then inside, it's kind of like the inside of a pumpkin. It has the cacao beans and gooey stuff like a pumpkin does. They pull these out, they separate the beans, and the beans are white when they come out of the cacao pod. The processing is what turns them brown. Now, colonials did not eat chocolate the way we do. They drank chocolate. It wasn't until about 75 years later that they actually started to eat pieces of chocolate. Now, chocolate was made in a special tall, thin pot, and it had a special stir. Now, our chocolate is very sweet, very smooth. Their chocolate was a bit coarser and not nearly as sweet. Sometimes they put water in, sometimes milk, usually water. But they'd put their water, their cocoa, and a little bit of sugar, and then they added spices, and it depended on the spices they had at the time. It could have been anise, it could have been allspice, could have been cloves, whatever was available. They even put pepper and hot peppers in. Now, the chocolate would be put in a pot, and you had to spin, spin, spin to get it the right consistency, kind of like a modern day blender would do. And if a woman was looking for a husband, she would have to be able to make a really good pot of chocolate. The next beverage that they drank a lot of, the next two, are the ones they probably drank the most of. And that would be cider and beer. Now, cider was made just like we do today with the apples. They'd press the apples. Once the apples were pressed, they'd take the juice. But we drink sweet cider mostly. They drank more of hard cider. They'd let it go hard because the alcohol would preserve it much longer and kept it going. Finally, beer. Everybody drank beer from the time they were weaned until they died. And children, of course, did not drink large quantities. But beer was made at the time with grains, and when they first came here, they imported the grains. Hops was the only thing that grew here naturally. And it wasn't until the supply met the demand that they started, the supply exceeded the demand, that they started growing hops here. Okay, yeast. They didn't do anything with the yeast. Some people have thought through the years that they caught wild yeast, but the monks, the priests in Europe, they had perfected yeast. So, rather than learn something brand new, they imported their yeast also. And one of the byproducts, whenever they were done with the brewing, they'd feed to their cattle. Usually a dairy was associated with a brewery in town, and the milk usually wasn't very good. The cows weren't very healthy from eating those byproducts. And if you lived in the country and you had no brewery available, you would have to be able to brew yourself. So along with everything else the wife had to do, the cooking, the cleaning, clothes making, candle making, she also had to brew for her family. So if you look across these tables, chocolate came from Central, South America. Apple trees were actually imported from Europe. They were not native. And they also brought honeybees to pollinate the apples. The grains and yeast for brewing came from Europe. Tea. Tea was expensive because it came from China. And because of the 1600 Acts, the Navigation Acts, they had to go from China the whole way to England, England to us. So that added to the transportation costs. Sugar. Christopher Columbus brought sugar back from the West Indies. That was one of his biggest finds. And then finally, coffee came from the Middle East, and finally it the West Indies and Africa, they grew it then. So if you look back, we weren't 13 isolated little colonies. We were a world trade partner, and our middle class flourished because of the commodities that we had to trade with the rest of the world. So, thank you for watching. Holidays for the colonists were quite different than what we're used to. It was time for parties and family and balls, weddings. Not so much gift giving, decorating, just socializing. And one of the things that they did when they socialized was food and drink. And wassailing was a big part of it. The day after Christmas, the poor people, would go around town and trade places with the wealthier people. Now, one of the traditions was they prepare a wassail bowl. And the wassail bowl would be liquor of some kind that decorate the bowl. They'd take it from house to house. And the wealthier people in the community would provide them with money. Now, whether they drank the wassail or not, we don't know. But they at least bought it, and it was a form of charity for less fortunate people. And one of the things that we're going to do today from the Williamsburg Cookbook, we're going to adapt one of their recipes for a wassail bowl. Don't have a bowl, so we're going to use a pitcher today. The first ingredient would be half a cup of sugar, and their sugar was a little different from ours because it was usually had a little more molasses in. So we're going to make a sugar syrup, a spiced sugar syrup for the wassail. They'd take a quarter cup of boiling water. They'd add half a cup of sugar, 2 slices of lemon, and cinnamon sticks. And they would boil this and let it cool. That was the simple syrup that they used for sweetening their beverages. Now, the next additions to the wassail bowl would have been fruit juices. They would add a cup of orange juice, a cup of pineapple juice, and a cup of lemon juice. And I've already put those 3 in together. And then add it to their bowl or to their pitcher. The next ingredients would be 3 cups of dry red wine. A cup of dry sherry would be added next, but I don't have sherry. That's an acquired taste. I would not want it. You could add another liqueur if you'd like. And finally, you'd have sliced lemons added to it. And if you'd like, you could also add sliced oranges. Every one of these recipes was a little bit different, so they weren't all the same. And then they'd add their syrup to sweeten it. They'd give it a stir, and they'd serve it over ice. And the northern colonies did have a lot of ice. As soon as the rivers froze, they'd cut blocks of ice and put it in special storage houses with straw to insulate it. So they had ice almost a whole year. So they were able to have ice for their beverages, ice to make ice cream. They had a lot of different beverages. So if you want to try this at home, you can find, there's a lot of different recipes. If you search wassail bowls, you can find them made with ale, you can find them made with cider, and another really good colonial beverage would be Martha Washington's rum punch, and it's made with either dark rum, light rum, whatever you'd like to make it with. So, thanks for coming to see us.